Before I begin with a continuation, really, in many ways of the story of Yaakov and Esav, which has tremendous repercussions in today's time as we begin to see, from last week, what happens if Esav had done tshuva, repentance, which he didn't, of course, because Yaakov did not realize that it was a tremendous opportunity. There's just a couple of things that I wanted to mention, which I think is very noteworthy. One thing we see, which is in many ways very important, we see that there are many leaders and righteous people, tzaddikim, and gedolim, rebbes, whatever, that are dying. Now, it is true that many of them are old, which is true, in their 90s or whatever, but it's also true that there are young people who are dying, who, in a certain sense, really have many more years that they can influence people. And not only that, I once mentioned a statistic. It was a study done in London where they estimate that there's 15.1 million Jews in the world. Not many. But in any case, out of that 15.1 million, they estimate that the Torah community, that observes the Torah at whatever level, is only about 2.1 million. That means 13 million Jews, according to them, are gone. Whether it be assimilated, right, or intermarried, right, which is integrated in the non-Jewish world, or just completely unaffiliated with Judaism. I mean, who would ever imagine that this ultimately is what happens in the Torah world, to the religion of Judaism? Who would ever imagine that the Jews would almost have disappeared? I mean, they won't. So the question is, what does that mean really based on the divine plan of creation? What is God doing? I mean, he never did this before, where so many Jews are disappearing, like I say, assimilation, intermarriage, and so on. What does it mean? Well, we don't really understand, what God is doing in a real sense, or in an absolute sense. But there is something which is very interesting. I once mentioned it a long time ago. There's a pasuk in the Torah that says, Lo yishokach Torah mizaroi, that the Torah will never be forgotten from his seed, which means from the Jewish people. So God guarantees that the Torah will always exist among the Jews. It won't be forgotten. What is interesting about that pasuk or verse is that all it takes is 10 Jews, or even 1 Jew, to know the Torah, and therefore it won't be forgotten. And meanwhile, 99.99% of Jews can't forget it. You see? So the pasuk doesn't seem to be saying so much that God will protect the Torah, that it's not forgotten. It's almost like he's saying that is what's going to happen. That we are going to reach a time at the end of time, right, where things are so bad, there's such great darkness, right, that only a handful of Jews will remain religious, you see. And the question is, we see that. I mean, 13 million Jews that are gone is incredible, you see. And it's all over the world. We're not talking about Jews in one country. The Jewish people in general, in a certain way, are disappearing. I mean, there will always be Jews. There will always be Judaism, because there in many ways there's a vibrant Torah community and so on, So there are things taking place. But when you look at the percentages, obviously, the overwhelming percentage, probably 80, 85 or 88% of Jews, that's enormous amount of Jewish people are gone. So the question you have to ask, what seems to be the design of God. What exactly is he doing? Why is he allowing this to happen? Especially when we saw COVID. COVID took a lot of Jewish people, a lot of righteous people, Talmidei Chachomim, Rosh Yeshivas, and so on. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, well, what is the agenda of God that he's doing this? Because clearly that's what he's doing, you see. Well, you could think of it in different ways, but my thesis is the following, Ultimately speaking, what God wants to know, you see, is how much will the Jews stick with Judaism, with the Torah, you see. So what the plan seems to be, that no matter how many people God takes away, how many persecutions there are, like the Holocaust, right? How many tragedies and destructions, and now especially we see tremendous rise of anti-Semitism. In the end of time, God wants to see the loyalty of the Jewish people, you see. So what he's simply doing is creating a situation, right, where Jews are disappearing, where the overwhelming majority of Jews are gone. So in a certain sense, he wants to see, well, how many people are going to stick with Judaism. They're going to stick with the Torah and believing in God, you see, which in a certain sense is the ultimate test of the Jewish faith. To what extent will the Jews stay with God? So therefore, what he's doing is removing those elements of Jewish life that promote Judaism, right? Or that reinforces Jewish values, Torah observance, and so on. And therefore he creates a tremendous darkness, you see, because he wants to see what is the ultimate end loyalty of the Jewish people. Are they going to stay with us or not? Interesting concept. We see that, if you recall, when I gave a shiur about the Akedah, the binding of Yitzchak and so on, that God used that, right, as an argument against the Satan's argument. Why do you love them so much? So God said, look, even when I basically tell them, or Avram Avinu, to kill Yitzchak, he will do it. He will not abandon me, right? So that incredible concept of loyalty is what gets God to say to the Satan, well, mida keneged mida, measure for measure. If they won't abandon me, notwithstanding the incredible, difficult circumstances I put them in, then how can I abandon them? Measure for measure. So in that sense, it seems that God is doing this. You see, if you think about it, Egypt had a very similar circumstance, right? In what way? Well, if you remember, it says that the Jews were redeemed from Egypt, basically, because they didn't change their names or their language or their dress. But in every other way, they probably looked like Egyptians, in a certain sense. They acted, they worshipped idols and so on. But they did maintain the identity of the Jew, which basically, when you think about it, is that they have the same way of dressing, the same language, the same names. So you see also that even though the Jews, right, are in a terrible situation, right, with the Egyptians punishing them and so on, they refuse ultimately to give up their essential identity as a Jew. That is what God needs. What he wants to do is introduce tremendous amount of difficulty and darkness, you see, and, anti-Jewish climate. Because he wants to see how dark do I have to make it, and what will be their response, you see. So in the end, that's what God needs, in a certain sense, not needs because he needs it, obviously he doesn't need anything, but that's what he wants to justify to the Satan. You see? Look how dark it is. Look how many Gedolim, right? Leaders, great tzaddikim. Look how many I've taken away, right? And they still stick with me. So therefore I cannot abandon them at all. And that will be the merit of their redemption, which is basically what the Talmud says, the Chazal tell us, by Egypt. In that merit, that they didn't change their dress, their language, and their names, God rescued them. He redeemed them. And that was the great test of loyalty that God wants to see. Because that, in many ways, is the justification that he could present to the satanic arguments. Why do you want to rescue them? Why do you want to redeem them? Look what they sin. So God says, that's true, but they refuse to give up Judaism. You see? So therefore, if they refuse to give up Judaism, even when they sin, they still do the major elements of the identity of a Jew. Then how can I abandon them? When you think about that, that's exactly what happened in Egypt. Even though the Jews, as we know, were in the Mem Teshai Tumah, they were at the 49 levels, right, of Tumah, defilement. They worshipped idols, right? And if they were in the Mem Teshai Tumah, 49 levels of, of defilement and so on, of course they were sinning. How else do you get to that level? Yet they would not shed the major elements that spoke that they are Jewish. Therefore, we will remain loyal to God in this way, you see. And that's what God needs as the ultimate argument to the Satan, that if they won't abandon me, how can I abandon them? No matter what I do, take so many great Jewish neshamas, souls, they still want to be loyal to me, even if it's in a small sense. What we are watching in many ways is that, look, today, everybody is all the Jews are all over the world. So obviously you don't have that anymore. All the Jews in Egypt had obviously a language, right, a common language, right, and they had a common dress, common names. But now that the Jews are spread out all over the world, well, obviously the names are different. I mean, Jew in Persia is not the same name as a Jew in Israel or America. So the names are different because everybody's spread out. The dress is different, obviously, and the language is different, and so on. So where is the loyalty? So the loyalty that God wants to see, even though he makes it so dark, right, is that Jews will stick with some type of identifying element of Judaism. I had mentioned this previously, that there are many Jews that can, for instance, can demonstrate their loyalty to Judaism because they very much they support the state of Israel. And they see the state of Israel as a Jewish state. You see? So that is an identifying element, And then there are people who are absolutely not religious, yet they will give money to a yeshiva, to continue Jewish tradition, right? Whatever they call it, and so on. So Jews can demonstrate their loyalty, steadfastness, in many, many ways, even if they're not religious. So that's what God does. He gives Jews the opportunity to say, I'm proud to be a Jew, even though, right, I don't do a thing in that sense, you see? So that's what we're watching. We are watching God creating darkness, you see, in order that the Jews can demonstrate their loyalty to God. Of course, from our perspective, it's very bad, because every time he takes a righteous person, we lose tremendously, because there's a certain light that goes out. This is the problem, obviously. But that's exactly what God wants to see. You know, how low can they go? You see. So that's why we notice that there's so much difficulties for the Jews. There's a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism. There are people saying that the anti-Semitism climate now is like Germany, you know, in 1935 or 37 or whatever, right? That's how bad it is all over the world, you see. And so, therefore, there has to be a rationale in some way of why God seems to be taking so many lofty Jewish souls, people who are great Torah scholars, Talmidei Chachomim, and Rosh Yeshivas, especially now with the advent of COVID. So many people have died and so on. In any case, so obviously our job is, listen, whatever God throws at us, we have to remain loyal. We have to show him that we still want to be close to him. You know, we want him to take over. We want him to end the exile, to build the Beis HaMikdash, and to bring the Mashiach. Anyway, I thought I would give that as an interesting explanation of why we see this. So many people, righteous people, leaders, luminaries that are dying. Now, also I wanted to mention something which I think is very auspicious and so on. And that is that America has now entered a very bad time. Why? Well, we know that in June of 2016, or excuse me, June of 2015, I think it was June 26th, the Supreme Court came out and interpreted the Constitution that you cannot discriminate against marriage of anybody. Yeah, you can't discriminate. A person can marry whoever they want. So they redefined the definition, I should say, of marriage. You know, not as the union between a man and a woman, but between a man and a man or a woman and a woman. You know, whatever you want. That's what they did. And I've commented on that. Well, that was the interpretation of the Constitution. But it wasn't a federal law. You know, the Supreme Court said that's the law of the Constitution. So on December 13th of this year, 2022, the Congress passed a law, and it was signed by the President Joe Biden on December 13th, where they created a federal law called the Marriage Act, right? Which now means that you cannot discriminate in marriage. Now it is the official legal law of the land. So it's sort of like bolsters the Supreme Court, their decision, their interpretation. So America has now entered a very bad time, very. Because if you recall, I said that the Medrash Rabbi, right, Parshas Noach says that what sealed the decree of the Mabul, the flood, right, that destroyed the entire planet. Well, what are we talking about here? A cataclysmic event that destroyed the entire earth, all living things, basically, except Noach and his family. So the Medrash says, what sealed the decree? And it answers, because in those days, if a man would marry a man or a animal, can you imagine that? He would have to write a ksuba, which meant that it was legal. And you would have to write a ksuba where you spell out your responsibilities to your spouse, whoever that is. God will not tolerate that, because that's fundamental to the end of reproduction. You see. So he said, enough is enough. I'm going to wipe out mankind, which he did. America has now entered the concept or the class of nations that are incredibly corrupt, especially in the whole area of marriage. So we could say America is no longer the USA, the United States of America. It's the United Sodomites, Sodom, right, of America. That's what America has done. They have now become, right, the equivalent of the Mabul generation. Very dangerous. Very dangerous. You see, and I believe because America has now disgraced itself with that war, that Israel, and I once mentioned this, right, that when Esav goes down, then America, then Jews go up. We know that from Ula'oim Mila'oim Ye'emotz, when Rivka came to get a prophecy of what was happening. So they told her, right, that you're going to bear two great nations. They will never be equal. When one is down, then the other's mazel will rise, and vice versa, and so on. Which is interesting. We have just passed Hanukkah, right? That's what happened so far. What essentially is Hanukkah about? Well, Hanukkah, as I mentioned, is obviously miraculous, you see. But what was the accomplishment of Hanukkah? Is that the Jews reasserted their belief in God, that God is the ultimate source of existence, of everything. You see, that's what they ultimately, and therefore they reclaimed, or I should say rededicated, the temple, the Beis Hamikdash. You see, in other words, they fought not only against the Greeks. A lot of people don't realize this, but there were many Jews that adapted Hellenism as a way of life. They are called the Messiavnim, right? The Greek bearers, those who bear the Greek, philosophy of Hellenism. There were many Jews that did that, a lot of them, at that time. So therefore, when the Jews fought the Greeks and won, they also overcame the forces of the Messiavnim, those Jews that are Greek, or, observed the Hellenism, the Greek way of life, you see. And what's interesting, I find, is that that's what really happened on Hanukkah. It was a conflict of ideologies or perceptions of the world, of reality. And the Jews rejected the reality or the perception of reality of the Greeks. Therefore, what's interesting, if you look now in Israel, Israel has achieved a very interesting status. Basically, there is not one person, basically, who is left or a progressive, you see, in the Israeli government. They have formed a coalition, and they're all right. Right means that they are all conservative. They are basically for the state of Israel, not only its security, but the tremendous amount of, benefits and advantages will now accrue to the religious. Yes. And one of the main ideas is that they're going to pass a law where learning Torah is now considered a basic value of Judaism, basically equal to, a secular education in Israel. I mean, that is a major step. So in a certain sense, if you think about it, Hanukkah, when this coalition was formed, that's when he came out and said, we have a coalition, happened in Hanukkah. And Hanukkah is the time that the religious Jews won over not only the Greeks, but the Messiavnim, those Jews who adhered to the Greek culture and so on. See? Well, that's exactly what happened. Think about that. Those leftists and progressives of Israel, right? People like who? Like, Lapid, people like Meretz, right? People like Lieberman, even Labor, they're all out. Meretz is not even in the government. But the other ones have tiny amount of seats. They are all in the opposition. They are the equivalent of Messiavnim. They're the heir of Rav, right? That especially last year fought Torah tremendously, right? And they are out of the government. So hopefully what's going to happen is there's going to be a tremendous amount of beneficial laws passed in the service of Torah and mitzvahs, right? And authentic Judaism. That happened, that coalition was formed when? On Hanukkah, which is the exact incident that happened thousands of years ago when the Jews fought the Greeks and the Messianic, those are the left and liberals and secular people then that wanted to do away with the Torah. That happened on Hanukkah. Isn't that interesting? The timing is very interesting, you see. So that's what I want to bring out, that America has now descended into the pits of incredible depravity and immorality. You see, I'm not even going into the insanity of what's happening in America in terms of the southern border, or the crime in the cities, or the economic situation, and so on. But the depravity, the morality, what they're doing to kids in schools is beyond belief, and so on. And on the other side, in Israel, right, they have been rejected. The Messianic, the heir of Rav, the secularists, are now out of the government altogether. And I'm sure they must be steaming and fuming that there's nothing they can do. All of this has happened on Hanukkah. Isn't that amazing? That's what I find, and so on. So that's very, very good news, you see. Anyway, so this so far is what's happening. Okay, so I've commented on, seem to be the latest current events, right, in terms of, what is happening and so on. Now, to get back into the discussion, because in many ways it influences today's time, the conflict or the relationship between Yaakov and Esav is really amazing when you really think about it. See, now I had mentioned certain very important ideas about that last time. What happened if Esav had done tshuva, right? And I mentioned that all of this is alluded to in one word, that Esav returned l'darkoi, right? He returned l'darkoi means his derech in sinning and so on, because Yaakov failed to know, right? He failed to know the extent of Esav could have done tshuva. That's what I said. And Yaakov failed to realize that, and Esav, of course, returned to his evil ways, which obviously is terribly unfortunate. I mentioned also, what happened if Esav had done tshuva, right? Then what would have happened? And I spoke about that last week. Amazing amount of things would have happened. You see. Now, what follows from this is something else. What the Rebbe did, which is very interesting, is the Rebbe said the following. You see, because Esav wanted to do tshuva, or he could have done tshuva, but he was denied that opportunity, right? That's what we know. Therefore, the Rebbe says to him that in the end of time, or even during history, there will be times that Esav will restore himself to doing tshuva, at least in the sense of the prophecy of the Yeshiva of Shem Ve'ever, where it says, Rav Yavoid Tzoir, that the older will serve the younger. That's the ultimate prophecy of the relationship between Esav and Yaakov Avinu. So what the Baruch says is because Esav wanted to do tshuva, or he demonstrated, not that he wanted, but he actually did, because he said to Yaakov, right, Yehi lecha sheloch. Let that which is yours be yours, right? Which means that he had charata, right? He regretted, or at least in the sense that he changed his mind. So therefore, what the Baruch said is that because you wanted to repent, but you didn't, because Yaakov failed to realize that you were very close to doing tshuva. Therefore, over history, I will give your descendants, right, the ability to really assist the Jews, which is Rav Yavoy Tzoya, that the older will assist the Jews. And we've seen that several times in history. And I'm going to point out to at least two things, maybe three, whatever. And that is the story which the rabbis, the Chazal, bring down. The story of Antoninus, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, who was a Roman emperor, right? Actually, he was the emperor of Rome. And his relationship with Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the author of the Mishnah, who was one of the greatest of the rabbis 2,000 years ago. And there's certain interesting stories that happen, where you see the togetherness of these two people. And that is a demonstration that the Baruch has not abandoned Esav, but he wants Esav to help the Jews do the tikkun. There's one story where the emperor made a decree that the Jews cannot have circumcision, you see. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who was the Nasi, he was the president of the Sanhedrin and so on, and he was obviously one of the greatest people of the generation. So, of course, he didn't listen, and he circumcised his son. Who was his son? Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, right? Rabbi Judah the Prince, as he is known in English, and so on. And all of a sudden the Romans found out, and they said, well, you circumcised his son, so therefore you are subject to death. So in some way they denied the charges. So they told Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, well, send your son, right? If you didn't circumcise his son, what they wanted him to do is to send his son with his wife to, I'm not sure if it was Rome or it was Judea, whatever, and demonstrate that you didn't do it. So his wife went together with the infant Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, he was an infant, right, to demonstrate and argue, that it really was okay to do it and so on. Yeah, but that would have landed her, really, they would have killed her. In any case, she went to an inn overnight, right, and she met a woman, and that woman was the mother of Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. So they became very good friends during that time. And the mother of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi said to this woman that she told her what the story was, that she doesn't know if she's going to live or not, to try to coax the emperor not to kill her or kill the child, whatever. So the woman said, you know what I'll do for you? I have a child that was just also born right now, right? Also an infant. And obviously he's not circumcised because we don't do that. So I'm going to switch babies. I'm going to give you my son, right, who was the infant Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. You take him and I will take your son for safekeeping. You will take my son to the emperor and show him that you never did. You never did circumcise, you see. So that's what she tells the wife of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, right, to do, and so on, which is what she did. She went to the emperor, or whoever was in charge, and she said, listen, my son's not circumcised. Now, they didn't know that it wasn't Rebbe. How would they know? You see. But in any case, So they said, okay, if that's the case, then you're free, you see. So she went back to the inn, gave Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, who had just inadvertently, as an infant, saved the life of Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, right? That's exactly what he did. He was instrumental, right, in saving the life of Rabbi Yehuda by demonstrating that he was not circumcised, you see. So, of course, the wife of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was tremendously thankful and so on. So the woman said, since my child and your child, their fate is so intertwined, I would like it that they should remain friends. See? And that's exactly what happened. What happened is that Antoninus, who this child grew up and became the emperor of Rome, God arranges all this, it has nothing to do with mankind, and he actually became Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, one of the great emperors of Rome, you see. And at a certain time of his rulership, he lived in Tveria, and Rebbe lived in Tveria. So apparently they reacquainted themselves, and Antoninus realized the greatness of Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, and he became very close with him, you see, very close, you see. And Antoninus used to actually come to visit Rebbe through some type of a secret passage, whatever. So what was interesting about that is that since he liked Rebbe so much, so what he did was certain things. And the rabbis talk about this, the Chazal talk about this in the Gemara, that once Rebbe was not feeling well, so he wanted to go to his bed. So there was no stool. Apparently the beds were high, and there was no stool that Rebbe could get onto and get into his bed. So Antoninus said to him, wait, I'll tell you what I'll do. Let me bend down on all fours, and you step on me, right, in order to get into your bed. I mean, this is the emperor of Rome. Could you believe this? So Rebbe said, I can't step on you. You're the emperor of Rome. And a person has to respect, the head of state of a country, especially Rome, and so on. So Antoninus said to Rebbe, well, look, better I only wish that, you using me as a footstool here in this world, you will do the same in a future world where I will be your footstool. I mean, it just shows you the incredible relationship that Antoninus had with Rebbe. But one of the interesting things about their relationship, now remember, Rebbe was a descendant of the house of David. That's where he comes from. And Antoninus, right, is Esav. He's the emperor of Rome, you see. And he was probably a Gilgal of Esav. So the relationship between Rebbe and Antoninus demonstrate the ultimate relationship between Edom and Yaakov, Esav and Yaakov, that Edom or Esav will assist Yaakov in the tikkun process, you see. Now, did that actually happen? And the answer is yes. Most people are unaware that the ability of Rebbe to write the Mishnayos, which is the ultimate oral law, right, the Torah Shebe'al Peh, is the Mishnayos. And the problem was there were many different, in about 180, 190, or 200 CE, right, everybody had his own version, his own private text of the oral law. Each Rebbe would instruct his student Talmud and give him notes. But each person's version of the notes was different. So Rebbe realized that you can't do that because he realized that the Jews are now about to embark into Golus. He realized that they're going to be spread all over. So what the Jews need is a common standard text of the oral law, one version. You see, not many, but one. But he couldn't do it. Why? Because in order for that to happen, he would have to call all the sages of Israel, all the rabbis, the great rabbis, the Tanoim, together and make this convention where each one would give their version of the oral law, and then the Rebbe would decide, well, which version of the halacha, the law, should I put in the Mishnayos? But the problem was, how do you converge, how do you bring all these rabbis together? You can't do it in the Roman times, because there's a tremendous amount of decrees against learning Torah. But at the time that Rebbe realized he wanted to do it, right, who was the emperor? Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. So he told that to Marcus Aurelius, this is what I want to do. So since he was the emperor of Rome, he made sure that there would be a tremendous peace in the land of Israel. So therefore, Rebbe took advantage of that. He convened all the great sages of his time, right? And they all sat, whatever, and they agreed which halacha, which version of the halacha, right, should be incorporated in the Mishnayos. Now, ultimately came that the version that was incorporated was the version of Rabbi Meir, who had the version of Rabbi Akiva, his Rebbe. And that was the clearest one. So Rebbe decided to use that. But in many places he brings down the arguments. The Mishnayos is the totality of the oral law. It's an unbelievable text. It has 4,192 paragraphs or Mishnayos, you see. And that has, when you think about it, over 35,000 halachas in it, you see. In any case, and he was only able to do that. Why? Because Marcus Aurelius Antoninus created a tremendous peace, right, in Eretz Yisrael, and Rebbe was able to convene all the sages to get together and agree on what the standard version of the oral law should be. You know, it's in many ways it's a similar where the Continental Congress, you know, Washington and Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, where they all got together and made a constitution. You see, because that's what's needed, is a standard version, right, and what the laws should be that the country's based on. Well, that's the same thing that happened with. He made it, which the standard version should be of the oral law. So it comes out something very fascinating. That Marcus Aurelius, because of what he did, he enabled the Mishnah, the standard text of the oral law, right, which is sacred, to be written, to be produced, to be created. Could you imagine what that is? But what does that remind you of? Isn't that the exact pasuk? And the older will serve the younger? It's exactly what it is. It wasn't just that they had a good talking relationship. No. Antoninus actually helped Rebbe create the text of which the entire Gemara is based on, and all the halachas are based on. He enabled them to create the standard version of the oral law. It's incredible, you see. So we begin to realize, you know, this person, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, isn't just an emperor. He was the one responsible that enabled the Mishnayos to be written. Therefore, could you imagine his reward? Every Jew who learns Gemara learns Mishnah, because the Gemara is basically a commentary on the Mishnah. So could you imagine that this guy, right, Marcus Aurelius, that he is responsible for the unbelievable promotion of the Torah itself? And not only that, but that the fact that the Mishnayos was written was a guarantee, basically, that Torah would not be forgotten. Because without a standard version, right, then nobody would know what the psak is, what the decision is. You see? Because there would be so many different versions of the halacha. So Rebbe, by standardizing the oral law and putting the accepted psak, the accepted rule, right, in the Mishnah, Marcus Aurelius is responsible as one of the greatest people ever known to further the observance of Torah. Think about that. It's absolutely astounding what this man did. Therefore, so we see, therefore, that the relationship between Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and Marcus Aurelius was divinely ordained. And in fact, both of them represent the real relationship between Esav and Yaakov. Right? That's what we see. Rav Yavoid Tzoyer, the older will serve the younger. And it's serve means in an incredible way. Talk about assisting the tikkun process. I mean, what Marcus Aurelius did was outstanding. Therefore, what I see is that Marcus Aurelius Antoninus was further reincarnated to come out in an individual, Donald Trump. Same idea. And I have a whole series of shurim on what that means. That in order, since we are right before the Mashiach, the Jews need assistance from Edom, from Esav. And Donald Trump is he's a Messianic figure. Of course, he's not a Mashiach, but he is a Messiah of Edom. Because a Messianic figure is somebody who's anointed, right, to do a significant task. And the task of Donald Trump was to do what? To assist the Jewish people. And when you think about what he did in the 4 years that he was the president, it was incredible to move the embassy, right, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, to recognize Israel, to recognize the Golan, to be the founder of the Abraham Accords, and then to stand up to the UN against their anti-Semitism, and then to throw out the PLO from Washington, right, and then to stop the PLO in Jerusalem from being separate, but to join them together with the embassy of the United States, and then to remove money from UNRWA. Right? It's incredible what the person did, you know. So it's interesting to watch what the Rasham does with Esav, that he continues the reincarnation of Esav in his primary relationship, or his essential relationship with Yaakov. First as Esav, and then certainly as Marcus Aurelius, and then ultimately as Donald Trump. You see, we can actually see the evolvement of this, of the relationship. It's a very important concept of what Trump really was, and that he continues to be. And like I say, because he is that type of person, you know, as a Gilgal, a reincarnation of Marcus Aurelius, and by the way, a president of the United States is the equivalent of a Roman emperor. You should know that. There's no question that Trump was set up to like Jews. I mean, his daughter became a religious Jew. His son-in-law are, of course, religious Jews, right? And not only that, most of his money is made in real estate in New York and so on, and they're all Jews in that. He's very familiar with Jews. His close associates, you know, his lawyer and so on, you know, they're all Jewish. It's amazing how many Jews he is connected to. And he himself has a tremendous affinity where he really, I hold, he really loves Jews in that sense. So how do we explain that? Where did he get that from? I mean, it was known that his father was good to the Jews, but his liking of the Jews in many ways is extraordinary. And the idea is that he is Esav, what is called Esav b'tikunoi. He is Esav in his corrected or rectified form. That's a Gilgal of Marcus Aurelius. See, so I wanted you to understand, we're not looking here at an accidental relationship, or incidental relationship. No. We're looking at history repeating itself over and over again to ultimately become the ideal relationship between Yaakov and Esav, right? In the form of Edom, in the form of the good part of Esav. And like I once said many times, we are watching an obsession by the evil of Esav, the Democratic Party. We're looking here at Joe Biden. We're looking at a tremendous amount of evil. That is the establishment, the deep state, that want to destroy America. So what we're really watching is the good part of Esav fighting the bad part of Esav. And of course, the one behind all of this is the Satan, satanic forces. That's what he's trying to do, because he realizes that if Trump succeeds in becoming president, he will destroy, in many ways, the evil of America, you see. And therefore, he's trying to influence everybody obsessively to destroy Trump. Well, we will see what happens in 2024, right? But it's amazing to be able to look at the Chumash and realize that the Chumash is not something that was. It is something that is and always will be. And there are so many things that can be understood, based on the Chumash and so on. You see, in any case, this is what we see so far. Any questions?
So if Trump is the tikkun of Esav,
yes, then
he's just here to show the good side of him. Like, what's his job then if he's already has the tikkun?
No, he's involved in bringing the tikkun. It's an ongoing process.
Oh, so he didn't fulfill it.
No, but he's in the midst of that mission. So I believe ultimately he will be president in 2024, primarily because that's his mission, and that he is Esav in the form of Marcus Aurelius, in the form of Donald Trump. So if that's his mission, then he obviously has to continue what he's doing. So I believe that he will win, and it's not a big deal for the Rebbeinu Shalom to make sure he wins. And it makes sense, especially with the revelations coming out, that the elections were rigged. The FBI and other government agencies actually were in cahoots with Twitter. It's astounding. Never happened in American history, where the government actually withheld information that would have meant that Biden would never be president. Because how in the world can you elect him as president, right, when the laptop of his son, Hunter Biden, shows definitively that he colluded and bribed and received bribes from an enemy of America, Communist China. Of course he would never have won. So he was right. Trump is right. The election was rigged. You see, all of this is coming out ultimately, I believe, to make sure that he will be president. And once he is president for another 4 years, I believe that he will enormously help the Jewish people, you see, to complete the Abraham Accords and to work together with the Likud and the religious parties to bring tremendous amount of Torah. That's why Israel all of a sudden is changing. Their government is changing, you see. And it will be very interesting to see what the House that just became Republican, what they will do. Because it's very possible that this year is a year that has to accelerate the Messianic process. You see?
Yeah, because the way you're speaking, you're already 6 years out. But don't we only have 8 years left?
Right. We don't. That's not much time, believe me. But you could see the pace is accelerating, right? You could see the pace is accelerating,
Right.
which is amazing. I mean, you know what happened in Israel is unheard of. There is nobody on the left in Israel in the coalition, which means that the right, the religious parties can now request, and they are being given all kinds of ministries, incredible, which will help Torah, spread Torah in Israel. And I believe ultimately Torah in the entire diaspora. You see it was looking at it in front of our eyes. And it actually happened in Hanukkah, which is what I started off this year, you see. But it needs also, once Trump takes over, then you're going to have the same thing. He's going to fight anti-Semitism. And I believe he will destroy the left, the Democratic Party, because they have destroyed America. More than that, they have destroyed the morals of the world. And therefore, I believe that the Bansham is going to take them out. You see. So, it's got to happen, hopefully, by 2030. And I brought the Zohar down. It says, 210 years before the end is 2240, which is the year 6000. 210 years before that, which is the English year 2030, will be Tchias HaMesim, which means Mashiach ben Yosef, right? The Beis HaMikdash, the end of the exile, right? And the Mashiach ben David. Could you imagine that? In less than 8 years. Actually, it's almost 7. Yeah, really, it's getting exciting. But we see the changes. We can see historical changes taking place. You see.
So, if Trump is Esav, all of the Jews are Yaakov?
Yes, definitely. All the Jews are descendants of Yaakov.
No, meaning we're doing the tikkun for Yaakov?
Yes, the Jewish people do the tikkun by the observance of the halachas. Right.
So in the next 2 years, we're still going to be in the slumps? Like, how do we still have 2 more years of Biden, so how do we...
Well, Biden is going to be, in many ways, blocked, you see, because the House will become Republican, so he cannot pass any legislation, because the Republicans will be against anything that he wants to do. So he'll be blocked for 2 years. It's called a lame duck. And besides, who knows even if he'll survive? He's an old person, he's got dementia. Who knows? The bunch will take him out in a second, and so on. Yeah, but the question then, what happens? Who becomes the president? I mean, we certainly don't want Harris, whatever. But things are going to move. Things are already moving. Like I say, historically, they are moving. It's unheard of, And next year is going to be an incredible year for this country,
Next year, meaning 2023, in a week from now?
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
Actually, it's in 1 week. Right. I talk about a year. It's already 1 week, right? Right. But like I say, look, the critical thing I feel is when Biden signed the bill, the Marriage Act, on December 13th, right? He made this generation, or America, the equivalent of the Dor HaMabul. Bad news for America, you see. And therefore, I believe certainly what that has to mean, because it's going to get much worse with the LGBTQ and all that. It's going to get much worse in terms of the depravity of what America will reach. And therefore, the Bansham, the Bansham is going to be true to what he did in Dor HaMabul. He's going to bring Mashiach to end it. So you are looking at the slow process as the sun rises slowly. You see, you're going to be looking at these things also coming.